So the referendum, well, generally speaking, the environmental movement, NGOs, charities, DEFRA, green businesses generally sided with Remain. And they did so because most of the sort of independent sort of evidence collected by academics, but also by parliamentary groups, by other European level bodies, pointed to the fact that generally the environment had, in very general terms, had been improved by EU membership. But the environment remained very low on the agenda. I mean, if you remember, the debate was dominated very much by economic and sort of sovereignty issues. There were some environmental groups that decided to speak out. I think groups like WWF and RSPB did try and campaign more actively, but lots of others either kept very quiet or ended up campaigning in a sort of relatively low-profile way. I looked for one slide that would try and characterise EU environmental policy. I thought, well, I won't show a picture of an animal or a tree or something like that. So what I've got on this slide is a slide which shows the increase in the number of pieces of EU legislation that have been adopted each year since the late 1960s. And I think what the pattern shows, well, two things, is that the number of policies grew very rapidly in the 1980s and 1990s. But by the 2000s and certainly in the last 5 or 10 years, the amount of new legislation being produced has generally declined. A lot of effort now really is going into revising and updating legislation rather than adopting new legislation. In total, there are about 500 pieces of environmental legislation. Is everything decided in Brussels? No, it isn't. Does it determine everything that has to be done at the UK level? No, it doesn't. Most of it sets minimum standards, which member states, if they wish to do, can go beyond if they so wish. So how is all of this legislation, most of it, which is relatively minor in nature, how has it actually changed the environment in the UK? Well, if we think about impacts on policy, governance and environmental quality, I think we can identify a number of key sort of findings which emerge out of the literature. I think when it comes to policy, I think what the EU has done is that it's inserted precise standards and timetables and principles into UK legislation. Legislation which before tended to rely upon administrative rules of thumb and lots of discretion being held by government officials and sort of street level bureaucrats. On governance, the impacts have also been pretty significant. It's increased levels of public participation through directives on things like environmental impact assessment. It's produced a lot more information on the quality of the environment. And it's also provided a check on government or executive power. So now if environmental groups feel that standards are being met, they can report those breaches to the European Commission, which can, if it so wishes, take a case before the European Court of Justice. On environmental quality, the consensus generally is that EU environmental policy has improved the quality, in general, within the UK. I say generally positive, though, because there are certain areas of EU activity, like fisheries and also agriculture, where the effect has been, well, to put it mildly, a little bit less clear, and perhaps we can pick up on that in the Q&A at the end. But one point I really would like to emphasise is that it's been a two-way relationship. This has not been the EU dictating how the UK manages its environment. It's been a two-way relationship. We've imported some ideas from other countries through the European Union, but we've also shaped the way in which the EU operates, and by doing that we've also shaped the way in which environmental protection is advanced in other countries as well. So how has the environmental sector, sort of very broadly defined, how has it started to prepare for Brexit? Well, I think like most sectors there was virtually no contingency planning at all. DEFRA certainly doesn't appear to have done much contingency planning. I mean, other than the Treasury, really, I think only academics really were doing a lot of detailed work before the referendum, trying to think about what the effects of Brexit might do. I think it's fair to say that the environmental movement was profoundly shocked by the results of the referendum. They clearly had aligned with the wrong side, and I think for many of them, they found it very worrying that there was this move towards sort of post-truth forms of politics, and many of them are still struggling to find ways to grapple with that. But nonetheless, I think many of them feel that public support for the environment remains quite strongly. So a YouGov poll commissioned by Friends of the Earth in August, for example, suggested that 83% of respondents wanted a level of protection, legal protection, that was either the same as exists now and within the EU, or even higher. I think crucially, only 4% of the respondents wanted a lower level of protection. Next week, I think you will see many of the NGOs launching a big campaign called Greener UK. There'll be adverts in broadsheet newspapers. They've signed up lots of MPs to a pledge which is that standards should be at least as high or even higher after Brexit Day. And amongst those 130, apparently there are 15 Brexiteers in the Tory party. So I think environmental protection does go well beyond the sort of the sort of distinction between Remain and Leave. I mean, there's environmental supporters on both sides. So let me just distinguish now between what might happen to the environment under a very soft form of Brexit and that might emerge under a very hard form. And I'm going to give, in the interest of impartiality, some examples of opportunities and risks for both. Well, the classic sort of way in which we think about a sort of soft Brexit would take the UK to be something a little bit more like the relationship that Norway has at the moment. So most EU policies would still apply in that scenario, with some exceptions. Bathing water, some forms of nature protection would not apply. But crucially, EU agriculture and EU fisheries policies would not apply, even in this form of soft Brexit. What would that mean for the environmental sector? Well, some would argue that it actually gives an opportunity for the UK now to redesign policies that it's always felt rather unhappy with. I mean, the Common Agricultural Policy, for example, and redesign it in a way that's fit for the UK's purpose. So funding, for example, could be diverted to funding flood management schemes, for example. On the other hand, the feeling within the environmental sector is that this also could leave UK policy in a rather servile relationship, taking policies from the EU but having little or no role in actually being able to shape them. What about a hard Brexit? Well, under a hard Brexit, virtually all EU policies would no longer apply unless they are nationalised by this Great Repeal Bill, or gerbil as it's now being increasingly referred to, certainly within Whitehall. Much depends on the detail of how gerbil will operate. But there are a number of, within this particular scenario, there's a whole range of sub-scenarios. So one possibility is that everything just gets carried across. Another scenario is that is actually some things are strengthened. Another scenario is that actually there's wholesale deregulation. Until we see the bill, we won't know which the government is opting for. What are the risks and opportunities in this particular scenario? Well, I think the great risk is that it leads to a wholesale deregulation, or at best a sort of shift to a kind of rather zombie-like form of legislation. So legislation that's nationalised, that's carried over into UK policy, but doesn't have the strong protection afforded by the European Commission and doesn't have that hard power that the European Court of Justice can use to pull member states into line when they do meet standards. So let me now close with 4 issues that seem likely to emerge and become salient in the next sort of 12 months, particularly in the environmental sector. And they are associated with 4 issues: capacities, devolution, international policy, and governance. So let me go through those in turn. This is my favourite cartoon. I don't know how many of you have seen it before, but last week in the autumn statement, the Chancellor announced, I don't know if you saw, but did announce some extra money for Whitehall departments. Most of that money, I understand, is going to 2 or 3 of the key sort of Brexit departments. For those departments like DEFRA is the department that deals mostly with environment issues, it seems to be an entirely different story. This trade magazine here, END's report, through Freedom of Information requests, has learned that the size of DEFRA has decreased by nearly 2/3 in the last 10 or so years. So what's the big risk here? Well, the risk is that all of this extra legal work is now going to fall on the table of a department that is really, really struggling to make headway and was already struggling before Brexit. What are the big opportunities? Well, the big opportunities are we can now sort of, use some of this 350 million to create new institutions, a new ombudsman, something to replace the Commission, or possibly a specialised environmental court. Devolution. A lot of the discussion about devolution in recent months has been about the role that the devolved authorities might have in the triggering of Article 50. That's only one issue. In an area like agriculture or fishing or environment, these are wholly devolved issues. So you can be sure as hell that the devolved administrations are going to want to have a very strong role over the way in which these issues are managed over the next couple of years and particularly afterwards. So there's plenty of opportunity for disputes, game playing, and confusion. Andreas talked about taking back control. Well, even if we pull back entirely from the European Union, we won't fully take back control of environmental policies because we, as a country, have already signed up to about 40 international environmental agreements. And that's also going to have to be sorted out. Do we, for example, as a country have to then renegotiate those agreements, or can we then just simply continue under the present arrangements, which are through our membership of the European Union? I think the big opportunity here is that we can regain, as the Brexiteers said, we can regain our seat at the negotiating table within the UN. I think the big risk is that if we're not negotiating with 27 other member states, our bargaining power potentially could be much reduced. And then finally, accountability. Again, very much part of the sort of taking back control narrative. This is a picture of the environmental legal group Client Earth winning a court case against the government over slow speed at which air quality is being improved in different parts of the UK. Would that court case be possible completely outside of the EU? No, it wouldn't. The potential to take a court case like that would certainly not be able to be taken right up through to the European Court of Justice, which has this ultimate power to fine countries if it wishes. So some final thoughts. I think environment at the moment is sort of still very much, has a very low profile, I think, in the discussion. It could be that it ends up being a great beneficiary out of this big trade-off that's struck between single market access and immigration, or it could end up being, I think, potentially a very significant collateral victim. Hard and soft Brexit, actually they're very, very different. As I said before, the trade-off will be made largely, I think, for non-environmental reasons. And really, just to sum up, I think at the moment, UK environmental policy is more uncertain today than it has been at any time in the last 30 or 40 years. So, thank you.